They call it holy truth, sacred revelation, divine instruction. But strip away the incense and the chants, and you will find nothing more than the doctrine of men long dead. Men whose bones have dissolved into forgotten sands. Men who built empires out of fear. Men who mistook their nightmares for revelation. Men who carved their trauma into commandments and passed their paranoia down as eternal law. Men who breathe different air, fought different enemies, dreamed under different skies, feared storms as omens and lightning as a god's anger. Men who lived in deserts you have never seen, survived tribal wars you were never part of, belong to patriarchal clans obsessed with purity, obedience, and control. Men whose worldview was shaped by drought, scarcity, superstition, yet their anxieties are now preached as your spiritual foundation. And somehow their words, their fears, their superstitions, their tribal politics, their imperial propaganda, their patriarchal obsessions, their hostility to women's autonomy, their suspicion of other cultures, their obsession with punishment and sacrifice, have become the eternal truth you must obey. In the digital age, in the age of satellites and telescopes, in the age where humanity understands galaxies, yet still bows to desert scrolls.
Men long dead,
Still governing the minds of the living,
men long dead,
still deciding what you should fear,
long dead,
still governing morality with iron age anxiety,
men long dead,
still telling you who you should love, how you should dress, how you should think, how you should speak, how you should worship, how you should interpret your dreams, how you should navigate guilt and desire.
men long dead,
Still whispering shame into your spine every time you dare to question their fragile doctrine. Their bones have turned to dust, their monuments have fallen, their languages have evolved, their civilizations have crumbled, their kingdoms vanished under shifting sands, their bloodlines dissolved into history, yet their doctrines still ride on your neck like invisible colonizers, like mental landlords charging rent and guilt and fear. Think of it, you fear hell today, because a man who died 3,000 years ago imagined flames he himself never saw. You distrust your own ancestors because a foreign tribe declared them evil spirits to justify compass and conversion. You kneel every Sunday, not because heaven requires it, but because ancient political leaders needed obedience more than liberation, and found religion to be cheaper than weapons. You silence your own doubts because you were taught that dead men knew your soul better than you ever could, that their limits in worldview should over who believed illness was a demon, poison was a curse, and women's bodies were property. The doctrine of men long dead has become the prison of the modern mind, a cycle out of the inheritance, wrapped in reverence and ritual, defended with fear, enforced with tradition, passed down like a sacred shackle. And the tragedy is not that they wrote it. The tragedy is that we still obey it. But the spell is breaking, cracks are forming in the walls. The old enchantments are losing their strength, because living minds are finally refusing to bow to dead ones, because breathing souls are reclaiming the right to think, because awakened hearts are tearing apart the inherited scripts, because the children of Africa are questioning the imported chains, the colonial catechisms, the foreign fears that replace their ancestral wisdom. Because no ancient manuscript, no scroll coated in dust, no text forged in the furnace of primitive politics should have more authority than your living experience, your thinking spirit, your liberated consciousness. The doctrine of men long dead ends the moment you decide you will no longer be ruled by ghosts, no longer shaped by myths, no longer controlled by the fears of strangers who never imagined you were.
They call it fear of punishment, but it's really the pastor's whip disguised as the biblical God's anger. They preach hell not to save you, but to keep you kneeling, trembling and obedient. They turned fear into a leash. They promise reward, but only after death, because a hungry believer is easier to rule than a fed one. They weaponize heaven like a bride, dangling paradise before the poor while pocketing their offerings. In their hands, eternity becomes a baited trap. They inject guilt conditioning into your childhood, teaching you that every question is rebellion and every mistake is sin. You don't grow, you shrink. Apologizing for existing, guilt is their currency, innocence their sacrifice. Like a uniform, especially on women, wrapping modesty around your body like a chain. Shame becomes a ritual, a culture, a cage. It is how they teach you to hide your own voice. Their obedience training is not discipleship. It is domestication. You are trained to submit, kneel, obey, comply, not to a divine being, but to the fragile egos of men who call themselves anointed. They hide behind hierarchical authority, building thrones from pulpits, pretending the biblical God endorses their titles: apostles, prophets, archbishops. Yet none of these titles feed the hungry or free the oppressed. They only elevate the crowned and humiliate the followers. Their selective scripture uses surgical, cutting out verses that expose their corruption while shouting the ones that benefit their power. When the Bible book contradicts itself, they choose the version that protects their seat. Their emotional manipulation masquerades as the move of the spirit. Crying, shaking, collapsing, not miracles, but psychological pressure amplified by music, lighting, and a community trained to perform belief. Their ritual compliance turns worship into choreography. Lift your hands, bow your head, give your money, silence your doubt. Religion becomes a theater where the actors don't know they are acting. Their isolation from outsiders creates a bubble where questioning is betrayal and leaving is death. They teach you that the outside world is evil, so you never realize the real prison is the sanctuary. They practice demonizing questions, calling curiosity rebellion and intelligence witchcraft. They label thinkers as threats because art's the first step toward freedom. They rewrite history, turning colonizers into saviors, missionaries into saints, and victims into sinners. They call their version truth and burn anything that disagrees. And with controlling language, they erase your vocabulary for liberation, submission, obedience, headship, covering, words that reshape your mind until you can no longer imagine walking free. Their entire system depends on suppressing doubt, because doubt is the crack where light enters. So they bury it under chants, threats, testimonies, and fear until you forget your own voice. Yet the same Bible book they worship exposes them. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Hosea 4:6. A verse that, ironically, condemns the very ignorance they depend on to survive.
Our promise of paradise became the greatest psychological weapon ever behind. Heaven was not created to save you. It was created to control you. When people had nothing, they were given something to hope for. so they wouldn't fight for what they deserved. When people were oppressed, they were promised a better place, so they wouldn't question the injustice in this one. When people were angry, they were told, leave it to God, so their anger would never grow into revolution. Heaven became the master stroke of manipulation, a perfect invention where the poor remain peaceful, the abused remain obedient, the exploited remain hopeful, the oppressed remain prayerful, and the powerful remain untouchable. A fantasy world was built above the clouds, so no one would look at the corruption on the ground. They painted heaven with gold, so you wouldn't notice the chains on your wrists. They described angel with wings, so you wouldn't see the soldiers guarding your resources. They promised mansions in the sky, so you wouldn't question the tycoons who stole your land. Heaven became the propaganda machine that convinced billions that suffering is temporary and exploitation is God's plan. They turned injustice into a staircase to paradise. They turned pain into a passport for glory. They turned human misery into divine preparation. A dangerous lie perfected. Your reward is not here, it's after death. Once you accept that, you stop demanding your reward now.
Heaven is the most profitable idea religion ever sold.
Because it requires no evidence, no logic, no proof, just your fear, your obedience, and your silence.
Why the believer defends the very system that breaks them?
The most tragic product of religion is not the prayer, not the doctrine, not the rituals,
but the slave believer.
a mind so conditioned that it protects its own cage and attacks anyone trying to free it. A believer trained to worship suffering and fear liberation. A believer who feels poverty is spiritual, pain is holy, ignorance is humility, questioning is rebellion, obedience is righteousness, and oppression is the will of God. This is not faith. This is psychological slavery. A slave believer does not need chains. The chains are internal. Every verse becomes a law. Every doctrine becomes a case. Every sermon becomes a command. They cannot think freely because thinking feels like sin. They cannot question because questioning feels like betrayal. They cannot resist because resistance feels like pride. They cannot leave because leaving feels like death. Religion rewires the mind to accept suffering as destiny and call misery God's plan. The slave believer defends busters who exploit them. They fight prophets who manipulate them. They protect doctrines that weaken them. They kneel even when the ground cuts their knees. They pray even when the sky never answers. They sing even when their voice shakes with hunger. They are loyal to oppression and hostile to liberation. This is the genius and the cruelty of religious psychology. Break a person's mind, then teach teach them to thank God for the breaking. The slave believer becomes the defender of their oppressor, the worshipper of their captor, the guardian of their cage, the volunteer in their own imprisonment. And this is why religion survives, not because it is true, but because the enslaved mind fears freedom more than it fears suffering.
Who really made the religious laws they call holy, expanded, sharpened, unprotected? Strip away the incense that clouds judgment. Remove the choir that softens resistance. Silence the threat of hell long enough for a clear thought to form. Strip religion down to its bones. Now ask the question plainly, without fear, without reverence. Who wrote these laws? Not who rubber stamped them with God's name. Not who memorized them. Not who shouts them from pulpits. Not who threatens children with fire if they disobey. Who actually made them with ink, votes, meetings, agendas, and consequences in mind. Holy laws are supposed to descend from God, unchanging, impartial, beyond politics. A religious laws read like human policy manuals. They regulate bodies with obsession. They police thoughts with suspicion. They manage sexuality with control. They reward obedience with approval. They punish deviation with fear. They look less like revelation and more like governance wearing sacred costume. These are not the fingerprints of divinity. These are the fingerprints of institutions learning how to rule. Jesus did not legislate. He issued no rule book to enforce. He founded no legal system to obey. He created no disciplinary code to punish dissent. He spoke in instructions, not regulations. He unsettled certainty instead of codifying it. He challenged lawmakers instead of empowering them. He broke rules publicly to expose cruelty hidden behind holiness. Religion did the opposite, deliberately. Religious law was not revealed, it was assembled. Assembled slowly, assembled strategically, assembled selectively, assembled in councils behind closed doors, assembled in debates dominated by power, not truth, assembled in votes where majority decided morality, assembled under emperors who needed unity, not conscience. Doctrines were not received from heaven. They were decided by men under pressure to control populations. And what gets decided always serves someone. Ask yourself, without fear, this simple pattern. Why do these holy laws always benefit authority? Why do they always protect leadership from scrutiny? Why do they always demand submission instead of understanding? Why do they always criminalize resistance instead of harm? Why do they always shift guilt downward and power upward? Because they were never written for spiritual freedom. They were written for order, compliance, and manageability. control needs borders. Religion simply made its borders invisible, emotional, and eternal. Sin is the most effective law ever invented, because it requires no police, no prisons, no soldiers. It turns the mind into its own surveillance system. You monitor yourself. You accuse yourself. You punish yourself. You confess against yourself. No empire ever designed a law this efficient. And they call this holiness. Ask the forbidden questions. Who decided that questioning is sinful? Who decided that doubt offends God? Who decided that curiosity starts punishment? Who decided that thinking risks hellfire? Not Christ! These laws appeared precisely when institutions needed stability. Leonis, but being stability, not when truth needed exception. Who decided that obedience equals righteousness? Who decided that submission is virtuous? Who decided that authority speaks for God? These are not revelations. They are administrative necessities. Every hierarchy must justify itself. Religion justified itself by making resistance a moron. Look closely, slowly, at what is labeled holy. Silence, submission, self-denial, fear, endurance, waiting, suffering quietly. And now look honestly at what is labeled sin. Blinking, destiny, desires, serve trust, refusal.
Salvation is not just a belief. It is a behavioral system engineered to control populations. It trains you where to stand, when to kneel, what to fear, what to desire, who to obey and who to hate. It builds your emotional reactions before you even understand your own mind. You grow up calling guilt conviction, trauma deliverance, and fear faith. Doctrine reprograms your instincts. It kills your thinking before your humanity is born. It replaces your intuition with indoctrination, your questions with commandments, your